All right. Well, welcome everyone. It's glad to see everybody here. My name is Dr. Myles Werntz, and I'm here with Dr. Carson Reed, and we are especially excited to have our special guest today, Dr. Russell Moore. So today's conversation is sponsored by the Siburt Institute for Church Ministry and the Baptist Study Center within the Graduate School of Theology, both here at Abilene Christian. And today we're going to be talking with Dr. Moore about the future of denominations. Where do we go from here? So just as a couple of reminders, we will be talking with Dr. Moore for the first little bit, kind of getting our topic underway. So as we are talking, go ahead and submit your questions that you have in the question and answer. If you need to send a comment, that's fine to do in the chat. But if you have a question for Dr. Moore, please submit that to the Q&A. So Dr. Moore, let me introduce you real quick, and then we will jump right in to honor everybody's time. Thank you again so much for being with us. And we're just delighted to have you here to chat with us.
Well, thank you for having me. Good to be with you.
So Dr. Moore is editor-in-chief at Christianity Today and the director of Christianity Today's Public Theology Project. So the Wall Street Journal has called Dr. Moore vigorous, cheerful, and fiercely articulate. Was named in 2017 to Politico magazine's list of top 50 influence makers in Washington, and has been profiled by the Washington Post, the New Yorker, among others. From 2013 to 2021, he was president of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention, and prior to that served as provost and dean for the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. He's the author of several books, including most recently The Courage to Stand, Facing Your Fear Without Losing Your Soul, and Onward, Engaging the Culture Without Losing the Gospel. So he is a native Mississippian, and where he and his wife Maria are parents of 5 sons, and he lives currently in the Nashville area. So Dr. Moore, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, Dr. Moore is our topic today, talking about exploring the future of denominations, what's happening in denominational structures. You're a leading voice in American Christianity, and even your own journey, your own path has been one that's characterized or had some migrations in it. So I wonder if you wouldn't mind sharing, to whatever degree you'd be willing to do so, about some of your own journey with regard to denominational life. And then I want to push that on to just get us to reflecting a little bit about the various kinds of migration that's happening, of people walking out of oftentimes established denominational traditions, but into new spaces.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe you would be willing to reflect a little bit yourself about some of your own journey.
Well, I grew up in a very traditional Southern Baptist church in Biloxi, Mississippi, a church that my grandfather had served as pastor before I was born, and was in that church all of my growing up life, and the entire rhythm of the week was set by it wasn't a formal liturgy, but it was a liturgy of Sunday school, Sunday morning worship, what was called training union, and then church training, and then discipleship training, which is sort of Baptist Sunday school at night, and then evening worship, and then Monday visitation, and Wednesday Royal Ambassadors, which was a kind of a Southern Baptist Boy Scouts, but about missions, and prayer meetings and sword drills and youth events and so forth. And so being a Southern Baptist has always been right at the core of my identity. And I was in that church all of the time. That was the major shaping formation on my life. And I served my denomination of churches for many years after that, after being ordained into ministry. So it's very much a world. The world that I grew up in doesn't really exist, and it doesn't exist because not only are there not people who have that heavy of a denominational catechesis just identity forming in most places, but also because even if one did, I could have at any point in my early life gone to another town and gone to a Southern Baptist church and experienced something of the same thing. Right down to, if I go into a church building, I usually can tell you when it was constructed, because the Baptist Sunday School Board would provide architectural designs for churches, and so they would look very similar. It would be the same Sunday school literature and so forth. That is not the case at all now.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, this shift from these deep denominational identities, liturgy, right, that you're describing, I think would be true for not just Southern Baptists, but for Churches of Christ, for other traditions. As a person in Churches of Christ, what you described is the world that I inhabited. So the shift that's taking place, what might be some factors for that? What are you observing as a person looking across the North American context? What's bringing about this leaving and moving toward this new thing, or these new things that are out there? What are some factors?
I think there are a number of factors. One of those would be mobility. People simply, even if someone is rooted in the same place over a lifetime, the rest of the community generally is not. So there's a significant amount of moving that is taking place. I also think that secularization has played a role, not just in declines in church membership and some of the other things that we readily see, but also a sense of, for those who are committed churchgoers, not taking for granted, well, we're Methodists or Anglicans or Presbyterians and will always be in the same place with this same group of people. And then I think there's a crisis of institutions taking place. You can see that in every institution, really, in American life right now, with the possible exception of the military. Every institution is being stressed and questioned and in crisis. And that's part of the issue with denominations. People are, it's much easier for people to recognize legitimate authority and community within the congregation they attend every week and the people they know, than to an abstraction, or what seems to be an abstraction of a denominational identity. And then the last thing I would say is, I think the past several years, in again, many different aspects of American life, old coalitions have been shaken up. So people will discover, I actually have a lot more in common with some people that I assumed were on the outside. And I'm realizing that some of the people that I was working alongside in whatever my church tradition is, maybe we actually were committed to different things. Might have been the same thing on the page, doctrinally, and on the page in terms of mission, but we had different sets of priorities and different end goals. So I think part of that kind of revelation, and then when you add to it the way that institutions have, and denominations, I would say particularly, have often failed the test of integrity in various different ways, that really accelerates the process as well.
It's very interesting. I love the way that you describe these various factors here. And I think that so when I think about mobility, for example, I think about a number of my friends that, they no longer live outside. I grew up in Louisiana. But so you grew up in Louisiana, and there's certain forms of Christianity that just might seem thinkable to you by virtue of growing up where you grow up. But then you move to somewhere else geographically, and then another form of the faith seems more thinkable, as it were. I wonder if you might so this question of institutions is a really interesting one. How do you find, well, like what are some of the ways in which you see the old institutions of denominational life? What do you say? How have you seen them change or perhaps weaken or altered in such a way that they no longer provide the coherence that maybe they did once upon a time?
Well, in some sense, the kind of cohesion that denominations had for a long time in American life really was dependent upon that sense of cultural belonging, not just to the local church, but to that denominational tradition. And so that kind of assumption that, I mean, I was never in a church that taught that Southern Baptists were the only Christians. We knew there were other Christians, but there was an attitude of, and bless their hearts. They're Christians, but we have a special responsibility as Southern Baptists with our sort of missions program, and a similar kind of expectation would have been held in the Methodist church down the street about their tradition, and the Presbyterian church in the next town over about their tradition. That is no longer taken for granted. So with that comes a lot of positive, but there also comes a negative, and that is the sense of you belong to the institution no matter what. Which means that the institution cannot be questioned and the institution cannot be left without a certain kind of exile. So I'm of the last people who feel guilty about attending a church that is not affiliated with the Southern Baptist Convention. Most people do not at all feel morally obligated to go to, when they move to another town, to go to the United Methodist Church because they went to one before, or to the Presbyterian Church because that's where they grew up. So, I mean, there are exceptions to that outside of Protestant Christianity, Latter-day Saints, for instance, and some other groups, but those are usually minority religions. That's not the case within most of denominational life. And one of the things that has happened, my friend Yuval Levin has written a book, A Time to Build, about institutions. And he notes that there's kind of a cycle, that the institutions are meant to form a certain kind of person. And it takes a certain kind of person then to give back to the institution. If the institution fails to shape and to form that kind of character and disposition, then those are the people who are going to populate that denomination or lead that denomination or that institution. And so it just continues in that cycle. And that's, if we were in a situation where only one institution were going through this, then we could say, how do we fix that one institution? But when we're in a time where institutions themselves are in crisis, and then that's heightened by COVID and the way that Nick Cave, the musician, has a new book out, conversation back and forth with a friend, and he put it a way that I hadn't really thought about, that the COVID pandemic was a trauma that we all went through together, and yet we all went through completely alone, isolated from one another. And so no one's unaffected, but we're not experiencing it truly together. And so that has taken some of these trends that we've been seeing and just accelerated them dramatically.
I was just wondering, in some ways, if institutions obviously or typically shift slowly. That's part of the conserving strength of an institution. And yet such rapid change in culture, COVID, and then you named it earlier, this growing secularity that's present in our culture is moving so rapidly that institutions simply aren't able to keep up, perhaps. Would you comment on that? Is that possible?
Yes, I think that's true. And I think part of it is that institutions are meant to move relatively slowly on purpose. That's part of what an institution is to do, is to conserve and to put the brakes on things that might go awry. So that's a good purpose of institutions. That can lead, though, to an institution becoming very complacent and believing people will always be here, and so we don't have to pay attention to what's going on, or at least to what's going on until it's well past the way that the culture has already acclimated to it. And that's especially true in a technological era. And by that, I don't mean that churches or denominations can't keep up with the technology to use it. I mean that we're in a time that just moves incredibly fast in ways that affect all of cultural life. So if you could imagine, there was a day when it was around Super Bowl time, and Amazon was going to have an ad about the Amazon Echo, and I was telling my wife that they had to figure out how to say the word Alexa without saying it and lighting up every Amazon Echo in the country. And I realized, if you had told me just a few years before that I would be spelling out a word, not because I was afraid that a child would hear me, but that I was afraid that some little device would hear me, it would have sounded like something Orwellian. But that is commonplace now in American life. So everything is moving very, very quickly in ways that institutions, even at their best, are finding very difficult to understand and to see.
Yeah. There seem to be so many different dynamics and so many different pressure points on these denominations. And so it makes me wonder then, if institutions by their very nature, if they are designed to move slow and to conserve, and we live in a culture that is accelerating, whether the future belongs to something like movements rather than to more traditional or stabilized denominations. And if that's the case, like what's gained in that shift, and maybe what are some things that might be lost in that shift?
Well, we have to have elements of both. And so there is a sense in which institutions left to themselves are going to calcify and are going to become complacent and are going to need periodic rattlings within them in order to stay healthy. And it's also true that any kind of movement, whether political, religious, cultural, it ultimately needs some form of institution, some structure that is going to connect it to the past and to the future. And without that, it simply leads to, think of the burned over districts after some of the revivals in the Second Great Awakening. And you can see similar things at work in, say, some of the counterculture movements of the 1960s or other times where there seems to be, this is the dawning of the age of Aquarius. Things are now changing. We're in this new era. And then you end up with a lot of disillusioned ex-hippies who are looking back and saying, where did that go? Because it really didn't belong to any institution whose purpose was to pass on down through to another generation. And so we can go too far in either direction, and we lose something when we lose either part of it.
I'm just wondering about that. It's always sort of dangerous to set up false dichotomies, but if we're thinking about movements, of which as a person in Churches of Christ, that kind of language is big for us.
Mhm.
We started as a movement, and we still talk about the Restoration movement or the Stone Campbell movement.
I have to be careful as the resident Baptist to not slip into denominational talk frequently when I'm around Church of Christ folk. Yeah.
And yet, frankly, we've the calcification occurs, right? A movement has to have a constant renewal for it to stay in that movement mode. And to your point, it also needs an institutional reality that sort of guides it and girds it along from generation to generation. So there's sort of this counterpoint that's being played out there. From where you sit, particularly in looking at, again, broadly across American Christianity, what are the impulses of movement and or denominational structures that are influential right now? Are there movements afoot? I'm just hearing things, for example, it's too early to call it a movement, but Asbury's having a revival over the last, few days. Or are there denominational structures that are denominations that are influencing in particularly leading ways right now? Thoughts there?
Well, I mean, part of the challenge right now is that technology has made the ability to be able to find new tribes much easier than would have been possible at any other time in world history. So there have always been movements within denominations, and there have always been trans-denominational movements of various kinds. Now, though, it becomes much easier for there to be a multitude of those sorts of things happening at the same time, both within denominations and outside of denominations. So, for instance, there was not only a time in which there would be, it depends on, in my tradition, if you were in a blue collar Southern Baptist church like mine, it would be pretty similar to almost every other blue collar Southern Baptist church. The big First Baptist church downtown would be very similar to big First Baptist churches everywhere else. Now, there's at a time, I remember preaching one time at a church that had 4 services that asked me to change clothes 4 times, because there was one service that was very traditional with older people. There was another that was kind of business casual, another that was very casual, and another that was kind of reaching the outside and meant to reach the outside. And so those sorts of differences in the same congregation would have been really unheard of as a way of life in the past. But now that's really not unusual to the way that we live our lives at all. So there are ways for people, if I'm interested in stamp collecting stamps with the face of Martha Washington on them, I could, I'm sure, find a community of Martha Washington-faced stamp collectors out there via the internet, and maybe even through the internet in my town. So that has changed the way that the options are even there for people. So you add to that, then, if you look at what's happening in denominational life around the world, you see almost all of the denominational traditions are fracturing. Think, for instance, of the United Methodist Church going through this split. I talked to a group of pastors as this was beginning to happen, and I said, "What is your church going to do?" And one of them said, "Well, the problem is everybody assumes that the Methodist Church just splits between the conservatives and the progressives." They said, "But what they don't understand is most of the conservative churches are 60% that way. with 40% that might be considered more progressive. And most of the progressive churches are maybe 60% that way, with 40% of the people who see it the other way. And so you end up then with not just this neat accounting of red churches and blue churches, for lack of a better metaphor. You really have a trauma taking place. And that's even true with, for instance, the Roman Catholic Church, which could, in at least many places, count on a cultural identity to work in tandem with the church. Now looking around and seeing not just secularization and the loss of religious belief at all in Western Europe, but looking at Pentecostalism growing at such a fast pace in Latin America and Africa. So these are even discussions that Roman Catholics would say, well, that's divided up Protestantism. That's their problem, and it comes from 1517, and that's where it is. Now experiencing the same, something of the same reality.
Yeah. We have several people that are beginning to line up with questions, but I have one more that I want to toss your way before we get started there. You mentioned the UMC in particular, and I've got a friend from the UMC that's chiming in here with a question, but maybe I'll preempt him here. What do you see as the role, not just with the UMC, but maybe more broadly, of moral disagreement as contributing to institutional shuffling, institutional shakeup, however we want to talk about it?
Well, I think that's going to be on a spectrum. I mean, obviously, there are going to be some moral disagreements that are going to be present in any institution. Some churches of Christ might not mind dancing. Some would. I mean, that's a really minor in terms of practice and identity of the church. You can navigate that, and then there are going to be much bigger questions. So the sexuality question, for instance, isn't just about how do we see this moral question. And it's about more than that for both sides. So for those of us from the more conservative wing of the church, it would be a question of Catholicity of the church as existing for the past 2,000 years. A question of authority. How are we going to deal with these texts? And a question beyond that of the mystery right at the core of the universe. If marriage isn't reflecting the Christ Church union, then what does it do? Those are not easily tossed aside questions. And then for those who would be on the other side, they would say this has to do with, as they would see, marginalized people who are being excluded from something that isn't, in their view, morally wrong. So it's a question of harm happening to certain people. That's not something that ultimately can be, in my view, simply worked through with a let's agree to disagree, because you ultimately, at the end of the day, you have to come to some recognition of what authority is, what family is, what is going to be treated within the church as one more expression of the human condition, and what will be treated as issues of repentance. I mean, those are not easily, that we can coexist in a society with different views about those things. But in a church, when the question is, to whom is the gospel of calling someone to repentance being preached, and what does it mean when we're officiating at weddings? That doesn't hold together. And so that's why we see the crisis in the Anglican Communion, for instance, with the Church of England that seems to believe that one can kind of take the via media through this, and is facing an Anglican Communion that is in complete crisis because of the differences between, say, the Episcopal Church USA and the Anglican churches in Africa and in Asia, which now far outnumber the Anglican churches in England. So that's just, it's a new circumstance that we really haven't seen before.
Yeah. I want to remind everyone to send your questions our way in the Q&A panel down below. So just a note there. One other thing I want to probe just a little bit here, thinking about this departure or the fracturing, maybe the fracturing of denominational structures, the rise of maybe local communities of faith. There's an inherent instability in some of that. And yes, there's also the rise and possibility of movements that we've identified. In what way does the great tradition, I'll just in a kind of in a broad way to speak about the legacy that we have as Christian people for 2,000 years, can that function? Is it functioning as a way of giving some institutional legitimacy or grounding for many of these new movements, these non-denominational moves or these undenominational moves that are happening? I'd be curious to hear you talk about that for a moment.
Yes, I do think that that's the case. I mean, if we think of C.S. Lewis talking about mere Christianity, sometimes people who really haven't read what he's arguing think that what he means is, well, just least common denominator sort of Christian religion. And that's not what he means. What he means is that there is a core to Christianity that does transcend some of these even very legitimate boundaries that we have. And I think that that's really clearly the case in a way that's not just abstract, but is really concrete to the way that people are living their lives. So in any given town, I mean, think of in 1960, John F. Kennedy spoke to gathering of Baptist ministers, associational gathering. That would have been very common, where the Baptist ministers in a particular place would have a particular kind of cooperation and communion that they wouldn't have with Methodists and Churches of Christ and others. In local communities now, it's simply not divided up that way. Even in churches that are denominationally committed, these groups are finding themselves in terms of affinity, even in terms of how those churches themselves cooperate. So you have happening right now both. You mentioned the rise of non-denominational churches. That's clearly in every data point that we have. That is clearly the case. What's interesting to me, though, and shows me that this is actually much bigger than that, is not just the rise of non-denominational churches, but the rise of people who think they're in non-denominational churches. So congregations that people have no idea that this congregation is actually affiliated with, say, the Southern Baptist Convention, or is actually affiliated with the Presbyterian Church USA, or what have you. For a number of reasons. And one reason being because often churches don't really want to make a big deal about that. They may love being in the denomination of which they're a part because they like maybe the mission strategy of that denomination, but they also know that with that comes all of the impressions that people would have of that denomination. So there are many people who are, as Karl Rahner, the Catholic theologian, used to talk about anonymous Christians. I think there are a lot of anonymous Methodists and anonymous Baptists and anonymous various other things in American life. That's new.
Yeah, I frequently jest that if you scratch a lot of these non-denominational students, you're going to find a Baptist probably not too far beneath the surface in many of these cases. But
Yeah.
so we have a lot of I have so many more questions, but we have a lot of questions that are beginning to pile up, and I want to honor our audience here. So first question from our audience: can you speak to the generational differences in how people relate to denominations? I'm a millennial, and it seems that my generation and Gen Z are fairly anti-institutional, while boomers are holding tight to the reins of power in denominations. What might happen as the older generations retire or step aside and the younger generations take charge?
Boomers are tightly not just to denominations, but to every institution. Someone was telling me the other day that his mother was having a kind of existential crisis because she was turning 70. And I said, most of the presidential candidates for next year are a decade older than she is. Speaker of the House, until just a few weeks ago, was 81 years old. I mean, you just go through all of these institutions, and that is the case. But what I would say is that the generations are not divided up that easily when it comes to this, because the boomers themselves have a different relationship with denominations than the generations before them had. So a lot of the trends that we're talking about right now started with the boomers. And so I think one of the questions that remains is, in some denominational structures that I have seen, the great problem is that some of us who counted on generational transition then can look and see that in some of them, the healthiest people are the least engaged and the most distant from the structure of the denomination for good reasons. They have lives. They're not interested in having a title or to fight. And the unhealthiest people are the people who are drawn to those things. So often when I was serving in a denominational position, often what I was having to do is to talk people into, you really need to be willing to serve on the tellers committee in your local association. That's how things change. But that's a big ask in this kind of time.
It's a big sell for folks my age and younger. So,
yeah,
that's right.
Yeah. Another person's asking about the term evangelical. What does it mean? How do you define an evangelical Christian today? We've not used that language in our conversation as I recall, in this past hour, but I think the questioner is also driving at something else with a follow-up question. Have evangelical Christians forgotten the importance of evangelizing? But I'd be curious to hear how you'd respond to those questions.
Well, there are often people who want to get rid of the word evangelical because of all of the baggage that comes along with it in recent years. I understand that. I certainly understand that, but I'm not ready to give up evangelical as a descriptor, because there's not an alternative. Some people will say, well, we just call ourselves Christians. Well, actually, to do that would be to suggest that there are no other Christians other than us. And in reality, what evangelical Christianity has always been a contested definition. But part of that renewal movement within broader Christianity, with certain common characteristics that one can see in even hymnody, in terms of the emphasis on the personal. One must be born again. A particular emphasis on evangelism and missions and the authority of the Bible. I mean, those things really are characteristic, even when we don't live up to them. So even people who for whom evangelical is actually a cultural identity or a political identity are at least operating with a guise of something else. And so we don't have an alternative to that word. And so I want to stay with it.
Stay with evangelical. All right.
Yeah.
So we have another question here, and this is kind of getting into some of the more practical nature of how new churches that find themselves in this gray space between traditional denominations might be able to navigate these kinds of questions. So one question that came in early was, and this I'll ask you as one Baptist to another. Since you are attending a non-denominational church currently, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So how does baptism work in that sort of space where you have, say, Baptist commitments of immersion, believers immersion, but you might have other members of the congregation who were baptized as infants? How do we kind of negotiate those sorts of situations?
Well, and
Churches of Christ people want to have a vested interest in this one too.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Well, I mean, this is part of the uniqueness of this time, that people are often saying we wouldn't have ended up together except that we've all sort of washed up together on this shore, and in terms of American life. And so there are very real questions and disagreements, but frankly, that's not entirely new. I have belonged to and served in Baptist churches with whom I didn't agree with the polity. I'm a Congregationalist, and some of these were elder governed, essentially elder governed congregations. Nobody in that congregation ever knew that I had a disagreement about it, no one, because I was able to say I can live with not having my particular theological viewpoint represented here. I wouldn't be able to, there's a step where that goes too far, and I wouldn't be able to live with it. But much of what happens right now is you have people in congregations saying, here are the places where we have to agree, and here are the places where we have the same intention, even though we have opposite applications. So I mean, most of the people in my congregation would be Baptistic, I would think,
Okay.
but not all of them, and not even all of the pastoral staff. We have a multi-denominational team. One's a Presbyterian, two are Anglicans, then there are Baptists all over the place. So that's part of what the disruption of what is happening in American life right now.
Yeah. Thinking about some of these newer churches, one questioner asked, the rebranded churches emerging since the rise of post-COVID, streaming appear to be generally more media savvy, focusing on a good Sunday morning show with more glitz. Are they also less concerned with doctrine? Is there a correlation there, you think, with media savvy and doctrinal lightness, or not?
Not necessarily. I think that's not necessarily the case. I mean, I think one of the we have good news and bad news coming out of COVID. One aspect of the really good news is when the lockdowns first started, I was anticipating the closing of lots of small churches, which is the typical congregation. I mean, I was thinking of my home church, in which just simply thinking, how are people going to give an offering in a church that has never used a QR code or even doesn't have a website? how are they going to do this? And giving did not go down. People stood with their church, and they made the adaptations that they needed to in terms of reaching people as best they could technologically. I think that's part of the good news, is we really didn't see the kind of collapse we were expecting. And
Right.
we also have seen that even in those churches where people haven't fully come back, streaming content is not a substitute for the church. And I think if we hadn't had the experiment that we've had over the pandemic, there would be many people who would think a metaverse assembly is the same thing or better than a physical assembly. We've tried that, and we've seen there really is something about the incarnational act of gathering that's more than the sum of its parts.
Mhm. Yeah.
So I have a question relating to your role at Christianity Today then. So as your role as editor-in-chief, how do you see y'all's role vis-a-vis this conversation about new emerging movements versus kind of traditional denominations that are in flux? How do you see CT as kind of like helping to arbitrate some of these things? Are you reporting on the dynamics? How do you see y'all's role?
Well, part of it is the heritage and legacy of CT was in many ways already in this place. If you think of what Billy Graham and Carl F. H. Henry were doing when they founded Christianity Today, it was to say we want to gather together people from multiple denominational backgrounds and affiliations, but who have a certain kind of evangelical Christianity in common. I mean, if you think of the Billy Graham family, that was multi-denominational, even within the same immediate nuclear family between Ruth Bell Graham and Billy Graham. So that was kind of part of the ethos. One of the things that we believe would be our task is to join people together who have that commonality of a certain kind of joyous, convictional gospel Christianity, and also to tell stories that are coming out of various denominations that really aren't just applicable to people in those denominations. Because, for instance, what we just talked about the United Methodist Church, all of those sorts of dynamics are relevant to churches of Christ that are thinking through, what do we do when we end up in some sort of intractable conflict? How is this working? So a lot of times we can see in things that are happening within certain sectors of the church, warning signs, red lights that appear, but we also can see what Richard Mao talked about really beautifully, I think, of each of these denominational traditions being essentially the equivalent of a monastic order in medieval Catholicism, where each of these traditions has taken a vow to emphasize something, even if no one else does. So the Lutherans are not the only people who believe in justification by faith, but they're the people who say, if nobody else does, we're going to emphasize justification by faith. And the Anglicans, if nobody else does, we're going to emphasize liturgy and sacraments. And the Baptists, if nobody else does, we're going to emphasize the personal nature of being born again. In all of those things, we need each other. Right. Even when we don't agree, we need the emphasis coming from the other. And I think CT is interested in helping that cross-pollination take place.
I think that's powerful and laudatory, and it's the sort of thing that rather than thinking about what's wrong or what's negative about my past or my tradition, to be able to flip that and say, what is the gift that comes out of that?
Yeah,
we offer to the larger Christian witness. So if I extended that just a little bit, one questioner is asking about what might, if I'm reframing slightly the question, but what might be contributions that come from the Black tradition or Black theology into this kind of post-denominational place that we may be moving into. What might be some contributions there?
Well, the Black church has done better than, in my view, better than any other wing of American Christianity, the holding together of institution and movement that we talked about some moments ago. The institutions within the Black church are strong and resilient, and some of that has happened because of historical necessity. Churches were often in Jim Crow South and other places really the institution shoring up the African American community there. So there's still that sense of institution with the sense of a kind of trans-denominational movement at the same time. Mm-hmm. And so there's often when I would warn Christians about, look, you're moving into an era in which even if secularization doesn't happen at the pace of Western Europe, you are in a time where people aren't just going to assume that they're Christians. I think that brings with it a lot of opportunity, more opportunity than loss. Black churches already know what it is to be part of a big global Christian tradition and to be creative minorities speaking into and changing the communities around them. So I think the Black church brings immense resources to everybody else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's good. It's good.
Well, I have one more question to kind of round out our time together here. And this is one that I think we've been circling around for a while, is that there is an increasing move toward non-denominational churches. And I think, Carson, you suggested something like that maybe the great tradition could be the thing which helps bind these together. Dr. Moore, can churches be confessional in that way, but not denominational?
Yes.
Do you see the kind of the confession itself as being the thing which can hold these congregations together, absent any other sort of structure or apparatus?
Well, I mean, the denominations as we know them are a development in time. And so Jesus is not founding at Caesarea Philippi the multitude of denominations. So that is itself a historical development. In terms of can they be united around confession, I think we have to be, because the danger with there are many people who will warn about the dangers of confessionalism, and that's true. That can become authoritarian and squelching. We have seen that many times. But in our time, I think what actually ends up being much more authoritarian are the unwritten creeds. And so part of what confessions of faith do is not just to define, here's what we agree on, and we really have to agree on in order to be in fellowship with one another, but also here are the areas where we can bear with one another, and we don't have to agree, and we actually can learn from one another, and sometimes have tensions that are held together that actually help everybody. That's what confessions can do. And so a church that thinks that it has no confession does. It's just completely unformed and not maybe not even articulated. Mm-hmm. So yes, I think there's really not a choice as to whether or not we're bound together by common confession. The choice is whether or not we do that intentionally.
It's good.
It's well said. It's well said. And perhaps, Myles, I'll let you close this out, but just thinking about the one confession that we all share in the identity of Jesus as Lord, it's a pretty good place to maybe wrap up this whole conversation today. So I would say thank you, Dr. Moore, for being with us. And Myles, I'll let you wrap us up.
Yes, Dr. Moore, thank you so much for your time. Thank you to our audience for chiming in. Again, this has been brought to you by the Siburt Institute and the Baptist Study Center, both here at ACU. And thank you so much for your time. Hope this has been good food for thought on the future prospects of denominational life. So thank you, and have a great afternoon, everyone.